Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think what the Salafis really want to say, many of the Salafis anyway, because I was once a Salafi, is that you in Aqeedah, okay, on those issues of Aqeedah where they disagree with the Asharites, is to say like things like, we don't want to deny something that God has affirmed for himself. I want you to pay attention to that statement. You will hear it. Something that God has affirmed for himself, we are not going to be the ones to deny it. So, break it down. What does that statement really mean? God affirmed something for himself. You are denying what God has affirmed for himself. You don't want to do that as a Muslim. If God commands something, you don't want to be the one to say no. That is kind of kufr in a way. If God said something and you say no, that is kufr. It's as simple. It's simple, right? But that's not the issue. The issue is when you say what God has affirmed for himself. In that statement, you are making a judgment that God has affirmed that thing for himself in the particular way you understand it. That's where most people don't get. It's not something like, what's it called? You are interpreting. You're interpreting something there. When you say God has affirmed something for himself, it's actually you that you have affirmed it for God. Because you are taking it literally, for instance. Eventually, when we ask you, you will eventually say, God revealed it in a particular language. And this is how it appears to us. This is what the literal meaning is. And if you take it literally, this is what God is saying. And therefore, God is affirming it for himself. You see, you have to do all those steps. You cannot go from a statement that you think you see, and then you say God has affirmed it for himself. Per se, in the way you understand it, you are adding that to it. Now, you're either going to have a correct interpretation or a wrong interpretation. You're not innocent anymore when you go further in your interpretation. When we analyze what you are interpreting and we see what it leads to, you cannot then hold your hands out and be like, I don't know. No, now you know. You either going to do tafweed, like I said, and say, God said it, I leave the meaning to God. That is the most innocent thing to say. But if you say God said it and this is what it means, and I don't know what it means, I don't know what it is, you cannot do that. Okay? So I felt like that word in itself, when they say we are not going to deny. So when I deny something, I'm not denying what God has affirmed for himself. I'm denying what you think God has affirmed for himself, which I think is a wrong interpretation. Now, it's not completely an argument against the Salafi position. It's just to show that we are both doing something here. And either of us is going to either have the right interpretation or the wrong interpretation. You're not innocent anymore. And by the way, before I even go to the Aqeedah issue, I already saw this methodology in their entire system before I even got to the Aqeedah issue, where they would just take some proof verses without contextualizing it and then generate a principle from that and say these are like on shirk and those other things. When you now penetrate it deeply, you start to see like there are nuances that is not explicit in what they are saying. They want to make it look like it's so obvious, whereas it's not. They are leaving out that they are interpreting too. They are part of the whole people interpreting. So, for instance, the four schools of thought, the madhabs, the Salafis will come as if they are objective, and only them they are reading it without any interpretation. Whereas, you see the schools, they are not denying that they are interpreting. They agree that they are interpreting because that's what we do. And we're going to have disagreements and we'll just have to live with that. Whereas you're coming as if you're objective and you're not interpreting anything. You're just reading it how it is. And you think that's no interpretation. And I've actually made a video about this on the whole Fiqh issue. But on this issue also, I think it applies here. When they say that statement of what God has affirmed for himself, they are as if they know what God has affirmed for himself. As if that cannot be disputed. As if that's not exactly what the whole discussion is about. We are going to argue if your interpretation of what you think God has affirmed for himself is correct. We can start from that. Okay? And then once we see, then this will be based on who's have the better interpretation. It's not going to be on someone denying God or someone, you know what I'm saying? Denying what God has affirmed for himself. No, I'm not doing that. I'm denying your own interpretation of what you think God has affirmed for himself. Do you see? It becomes kind of subjective, and then whoever has the better argument should present it, and then we can go from there. So I think this will clarify the whole issue more, such that every person will know his own position and will not feel like his interlocutor is disingenuous or something like this. Let's be clear with our language. Let's be clear in what we are trying to say. So I think if you think what I'm saying makes sense, or if you have any idea, put your comments in the comment section. See you guys later. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.